I Ishquail CM, everyone. A very warm welcome for more to you, all of you, and for most generously spending your lunch hour and beyond with us. Believe me, you will be truly rewarded by our knowledge keeper for whom we have immense respect. My name is Tara Shishtarian, a South Asian guest settler residing on the territories of the Coast Salish peoples here in Burnaby, and I have the honor to be your MC for today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the treaty lands and unceded, unsurrendered territories of the First Nations that we have been given the privilege to call our home. And we continue to reiterate our commitment to DRIPA, the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So, to start us in a good way, we would like to humbly offer the teachings of this wonderful story. And I'm going to be saying a few Cree words and a few Hunkamalum words, and I hope you forgive my pronunciation in some of the cases. So, to begin with, Tapwe Naitesanak, which in Cree means truly my relatives. Come sit close now. The fire is warm and the night is listening. I want to tell you an old story, not just any story. This one carries the memory of the land, the way our ancestors once lived in balance. A story that still grows every spring when we return to our gardens with prayers in our hearts and dirt under our fingernails. This is the story of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. A long time ago, when the world was still quiet and the rivers sang their songs without interruption, the Creator gave us three sisters to walk with us, not as people, but as plants. They came not with words, but with teachings, and if you listen close, you'll still hear them today. Corn, the eldest, was tall and proud. She stood straight like a lodgepole, always watching, always steady. She reached for the sun and made space for the others. Corn reminds us of our responsibilities to stand firm, to hold space, to offer stability when the winds of change come. Beans, the second sister, she was the one who needed someone to lean on, and so she wrapped her arms around Corn, not because she was weak, but because she understood connection. She grew with Corn, climbing, twining, offering back the gift of nourishment to the soil. You see, beans taught us about interdependence, that it's okay to lean on others, and it's sacred to give back more than you take. And then there was Squash, the youngest. She was quiet and humble, growing low to the ground, spreading wide. Her broad leaves protected the earth, kept the moisture in, kept the weeds out. Squash is the guardian, like our grandmothers, who watch over the lodge, who heal with soft hands and fierce love. She reminds us that protection can look gentle, but it runs deep. These sisters, they never grow alone. You plant one, you plant them all. Because they're family, because they need each other, just like we do. We plant them in a mound not just as farmers, but as keepers of a covenant. We pray with tobacco, we speak our gratitude, and we remember that our strength is not in how tall we stand, but how well we care for one another. And so, my grandchildren, when you see the three sisters in the garden, know that you are looking at a sacred story, one of balance, one of kinship, one of survival through love, connection, and humility. Even today, those sisters are still whispering to us in every meal we share, in every planting we do, in every time we choose to walk together instead of alone. We are not just growing food, we are growing memory. We are growing the old ways. And those sisters, they're still growing inside us. Ekosani, Naiti Sinak, Mikwich, walk gently, plant with love, my relatives. Thank you. So, again, a very warm welcome to the West Coast Climate Action Network's Lunch and Learn webinar with Jared Qwustenuxun, Williams. I hope I said that right, Jared. Just a little bit about ourselves. We Can is an active volunteer run network of 293 climate action groups across British Columbia, all of which share our feelings of deep urgency and reality of the climate crisis. Our determined hope is that together we can make a difference and build a better world. Today, we are honored to welcome Jared Qwustenuxun Williams, a passionate Indigenous foods educator who had the privilege of spending much of his youth with his late grandmother immersed in Salish culture. After graduating from culinary school, he spent more than a decade working in restaurants across BC. Qwustenuxun works as not only as an Indigenous foods educator, but he's also a writer and a consultant for various universities, ministries, and health authorities. He was also elected as the chair of the Indigenous Advisory Council to the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. For me, and I think for all of us, he is a guru in furthering Indigenous food sovereignty and security, and a proud teacher of the Hakamilam speaking language. Thank you very much, and please extend a big, warm welcome to Jared. Over to you, Jared.
Oh, hi, Chika. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. The video of all those youth hopping around, oh my goodness, I could watch that all day. Just like realizing how so much of what I do is for the next ones. I was raised by very strong individuals and they were very much worried about the next generation. And as, someone who was, young once, always wondering why it was so valuable for them to look after us in the right way. And so all these years later that I'm here, I learn. I think we realize what the adults in our lives were up to when we are the adults in the lives of our young ones. But thank you very much for that. And yes, you absolutely had my name correct, Qwustenuxun. And I'll just share some slides and we'll hop right into it. So I guess I'll highlight two things while these load. One, if you have any questions, please add them in the chat. I will not answer them until after I walk through all my slides because I am a bit of a storyteller. And if I start answering questions, we won't get through my slides. But I ask you to have them in the chat because if you're anything like me, you'll have an idea about a question, and if you hold on to it, it'll leave and you won't remember it. But if you put it in the chat, it will stay there until we're done. Next, I'm going to be speaking about what I know, which is Indigenous food systems, and I think that over this presentation, I can really link it to climate and without even needing to do much change or alteration to it, our ancestors lived in a way that they understood their link to the land, not even their link to the land, but that they themselves were the land walking, right? The understanding that what we do to the land, we do to ourselves. We do to the air, we do to ourselves. We do to the water, we do to ourselves. We are the land, the air, and the water. And so that understanding is woven throughout all of this, and hopefully it will help us understand not just where the ancestors that I have who lived here were uh, pre-contact, but really how we can use their knowledge to advance in this new world that we're in. So let's jump into it. Who am I anyway? Siem na siya, siem na swalakwa, siem na swalmoch, enta swalmosne Qwustenuxun. Siem skook Quw'utsun mastimoch, chitzel lalamechen de cholmos allens, cholmoch lachen. Hitzapka, siem na siya, yeah. If I was to do the introduction at home, all the elders would say, Shah, that's just about you. Who are you? Who owns you? Who are you from? We're always so concerned at home about our lineage. We're never concerned about who you are. It's about who you represent. I can quite easily remember, almost if I can hear her in the room with me now, my grandmother chastising me when I would do something wrong about how I am a reflection of my family. She'd say, "You're a reflection of your family. What you do, everybody will assume is the way we are." And so this is who I am. I've walked in these two worlds my whole life. My mother's family comes from Scotland and Holland, and specifically Hilversum, Holland, and Inverness, Scotland. And my father's family comes from Snuneymuxw, Nanaimo, and Quw'utsun, or uh, um, Cowichan. But the more I learned about it, the more I realized that I'm related kind of to all nations from like Nanoose, like Bay down to Lummi Island. And I learned that very humorously at a young age, as my grandmother would chastise me about how I was not allowed to run around with any of the young native girls because they're all your close family. Nanoose Bay to Lummi Island. Ah, it's all your family. So we learn very quickly who we are and who we're related to, and highlighting that that's who we are. But while we're here, I also need to explain something very important. Anything I highlight here today, any knowledge I share, any words I use, any um, teachings I hold, or I share with everybody, I need you to understand that those are not mine. Okay. I take no ownership of this knowledge. I take no uh, credit of this knowledge. This knowledge is my family's and my community's and my ancestors' knowledge. And I am just so privileged to have had the opportunity to spend time with our elders, with our relatives, and to learn our language. And our language on its own unlocks so much knowledge. And so just really wanting to ensure that if you leave here today and you say, oh, he said this, he said that, that you attribute those not to me, but to my home community. This is what you heard from this individual from Cowichan, right? Not this is, Jared's teachings, because they're not mine. They're just what I've heard and how I live as a result of those who raised me. And really, to wrap it all up, the elders highlight constantly that wherever we are, our ancestors are there with us. We walk around and our ancestors are walking around with us. We never go anywhere alone. And they're here, in the room, they'd say, even in, this new Zoom room we're all in, all your ancestors are with you and they're watching you and they want only the best for you. And so I need to acknowledge all of them in this and highlighting that this knowledge is theirs. And for anybody that looks at that and you think maybe it's a bit woo-woo or esoteric, what is our genetics? What are our genes, if not our ancestors living within us? The nose I wear is my great grandfather's nose. My hair is my grandmother's hair, right? Like we are the result of all of these people. If we were to go back enough generations, we've got hundreds, if not thousands, of ancestors that worked to design who you are today, whether it's your genetics, your language, the way you live in this world, where you live, it's all the result of them. So always remembering who we really are. So I like to highlight this is where I learned everything I know. I was very lucky. My grandmother, she raised me, and I don't highlight that as the fact that, she was the only one, but my mom and dad worked a lot. And I spent many years with my uh, my grandmother while my mom was at work, or if they were on holidays or, on weekends and things, I would spend with my uh, grandmother. And in that space, I was tremendously lucky to be able to learn from her and you know, to really get real and vulnerable. Like my grandmother's children went to residential school, right? And her husband went to residential school. And she was one of the few people in her generation that never went. She was literally hidden when she was young, so she wouldn't have to attend. And when you're hidden and when you don't attend, the elders of her time would have handed her knowledge because they knew she wouldn't lose it. It wouldn't be stolen from her in one of those schools. And so she witnessed most of her children, obviously not all, but the majority of her children went to these schools. And she, as a result of her husband attending, he didn't want that information to be handed over to his children because he's worried they would be hurt. Right? That's, reality. You're just looking after your young ones. You don't want them to speak the language because if they speak it at these schools, they'll be hurt. Right? And so I arrived at a very unique time in my uh, grandmother's life. I arrived 4 years after the last local residential school closed, and so in my family, we are the first generation to not have to attend residential school, and so she used that opportunity unbeknownst to me to hand me the knowledge that she'd held and waited for an opportunity to share. And so quite frequently a lot of my relatives will ask me things like, where did you learn that, how did you learn that? And this is, as I've referenced already, this is all hers. A lot of it was from her. And I use this uh, uh, a diploma just because I want to remind anybody that's got young ones at home that we need to not always encourage them to go to university. I love university. I'm happy for those who can attend. If you went to university, that's amazing, excellent work. But some of our children need to stay home. Some of our children need to learn our languages, not just our traditional languages. We all come from somewhere in this world, and all those home villages, all those home nations have languages that are so beautiful, and they have traditional, you know, uh, foods and ways of linking to the land. And if we stop passing that information through the generations, it'll be lost. And so, always remembering that not everybody needs to head off to be educated. Some can stay home to be educated. And I was very lucky to be able to stay home and be educated in that way. And as a result, I can highlight everything I'll be highlighting here with you all here today. So as we're about to walk into what I call an intellectual minefield, I need to try to ensure that everybody is aware that um, the colonial education like system, specifically up until the late 90s, was designed to create a very false narrative of the way that Indigenous communities existed, specifically on the west coast of Canada, but all across uh, Turtle Island. Um, the one of the main acts, one of the main laws or acts that allowed colonization to happen the way it happened was something called terra nullius, which is the idea that if the local indigenous community was not using the land, wasn't using it for agriculture or homesteading, that it was then up for grabs. And so, in that idea, if and when the colonists arrived, if they could assume that the land wasn't being used, they could have it freely. And to, to allow that narrative to continue, we've all been educated quite often that Indigenous communities were hunter-gatherer societies, kind of stumbling their way through the wild, eating whatever was lying around, and that we weren't utilizing the land to its full potential. And in a lot of climate and conservation organizations, the idea is frequently to leave land, let it return, to rewild. But we need to remember that humans are an integral aspect of the ecosystem and that we can help the land. We don't need to leave it alone. We need to live with it. And so a lot of what I'll be highlighting is stuff that was really left out of that education so that we can have a, a fuller idea of how indigenous communities lived on the land, with the land, and held the land. And in that is that we had um, agriculture and we had governance and we had an economy and land ownership and private property. And all these ideas are things that many of us were raised to assume they didn't exist. So let's hop into that. Um, uh, Governance. There's this amazing phrase. I don't know who used it, but it's that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And so I want to bunk that idea with this reality. If you look to the left-hand side, this is a rather old chart. It was written by a man named um, S- Suttles in 1985. So some of the wording is a little old and out of date, but the idea is there. And it's if you were to look it up online, it's called the inverted pear-shaped society. So the society we live in now is very much a triangle with, right, the 1% on the top and everybody else underneath, with the vast majority of us in the lower levels of the modern uh, classist society. And that's okay. That's just how it is. I'm not here to argue that, but I want to view and understand the way that my ancestors on these lands lived so that we can see that there are other options. So right away you can like see that this, if this was a triangle, which it is not, it is upside down. At the very lowest area, the 1%, it says slaves. Now, that's a hard translation, okay? We have a very new age idea of the word slaves that link us to African slavery and even Roman slavery, which was very ruthless. But as you can also read, the only um, input for slavery was war captives. And so some older elders will reference that slavery was more a way of introducing new genetics from other areas to not always have just the same families in some spaces. But you can also see that slaves were able to move upwards. There's those arrows that move up. And so slaves were not treated without respect. They were treated with respect. They were looked after. They were not abused. This is not an ability to treat these humans as less than. It was a way to relocate them unwillingly, but relocate them. And so they would move into what is phrased here as worthless, but I like to use the term unnamed. So in Coast Salish society, we were divided into houses. If you look in, the background there, you can see a few houses. This is the villages of Cowichan, and that's now known as this area is actually now called Joe Road. But these houses are homes to up to 100 individuals could live in a home. And each home is a unit of a family. So everybody in that home would be in one family. And in order to be linked into that family, you need to wear a family name. In this new world, we wear last names, which highlight which families we're from. In the old world, our names, there were only one name. You did not have a last name. Our names were like our last names. They were our family names. So you could only name your child a name that is within your family genealogy, and that name linked them to that house. So if you did not have a name, you on this like chart would be what is phrased as worthless. But if you had a name, you move up a level to what is phrased in this chart as good. And within the good and leaders dynamic here, those are individuals that were within houses. They were the ones who controlled their wealth and their family. And I think what is very integral to this idea is the lack of a military presence. Leadership in this new world and in the Western world, leadership was upheld through a military presence. In this new world, it's the army or the RCMP, and in the old world, it was, the knights and the executioners. But in traditional Salish society, there was no police force, there was no standing army. So if the leader chose something that the house did not want, they would simply be replaced. As I've heard it explained by elders, the leader, the hiwak, I don't use the word chief. That's a new word that's created through the Indian Act. We had what we call hiwak, and hiwak is the house leader, and they are chosen normally by the women of the house to lead the house. But when I say lead, they're just simply the one to speak what everybody wants. They're the ones that say this is what we will be doing. They're the ones to help everything work out so that everybody in the house can succeed. And those houses would work in unison with each other to ensure the entire village would succeed. And so if you look here, the majority, well over 75% of individuals had the control over their well-being, their life, their life directions. They had all the wealth, they had all the opportunity, and it was the vast majority who had it. So just trying to re-envision another alternative because we don't need to leave the world up to the 1% because look what happens when we do. This other idea of land ownership, that once again, terra nullius, right? They want you to think we didn't own land so that when they stole the land that you would assume that it was okay, we weren't using it anyway. What's interesting to me that helps us understand that that was not true was two things. One is the names, which I'll walk into in 1 or 2 seconds here, and the other is that there are laws in our home communities about harvesting from spaces that weren't yours. There would be camas meadows or fishing weirs or clam beds that were all owned specifically by a house or a family or a village. And within that, there were also spaces that we looked at as community harvesting spaces anybody could use. But there were also very private spaces that if you were to be caught trespassing or harvesting in those spaces, you could um, face severe legal repercussions in our traditional society. So for on that last chart, the slaves or the worthless people, they would be able to harvest from the uh, community areas, but those um, uh, private areas were only to be harvested by those individuals that are from houses that literally owned those spaces. Now, what was I talking about? Space names or place names. So in this new world, and I don't know how to navigate it without just being kind of off the cuff, but many of our places are named after old white men. Um, if you look on this map, places you'll recognize right away are Mount uh, uh, Prevost, named after Admiral James Prevost, who lived here for all of a year or two. I think it was actually only 3 months. I'm trying to be generous. He now has his name on our mountain, one of our islands wears his name and the name of his children, and there are a few lakes that also wear his name. And our town here is named after a gentleman. I believe his last name was Duncan, but I'm willing to be wrong. But they named the town after his farm. He had a farm that he didn't really realize was on top of a traditional agricultural site, but we'll walk into that in a minute. But it's named after someone, normally a man, and we never did that. Our traditional way never would exist like that. Elders would try to highlight that our language is like a recipe for life. So what do they mean? So I'll hand you three examples of how we name things. We name things only after three things. An ancestral legend of what happened on that land, which the example here would be Swakas, which is now known as Mount Prevost. Without going through the whole of the story, we have an early creation legend that involves one of our first ancestors and a small dog that he had named Swakas. And through all these legends, he walked around this land with this dog. And when the dog passed away, he left the dog on the top of this very visually unique mountain. And so, thousands of years later, when we look up to that mountain, we remember Swakas, the name of that small dog. Elders would even like say that it's not necessarily the name of the mountain, but we remember Swakas. So that's how we link the legends to the land. Another would be there's an area in the lower river. I don't know if it's on this map. I've never really located it, but it's called Qwustenuxun. And Qwustenuxun is translates like to like the nose. And in this area of the lower river, there's a large rock name that looks like a nose. And so therefore they named the area the nose because it's visually obvious what it was named for. The last one is more that recipe for how we lived. And there's an area, well, there's a few areas on here I could use an example, but the easiest one is an area off of Salt Spring Island, now known as Long Harbor. Long Harbor's traditional name is S'atch. S'atch means halibut. Wonder what we were doing at S'atch. So a lot of spaces on here have things we were harvesting there. There's Qwustenuxun, now known as Satlam, which translates to the place of the maple trees. There's a place on here called and which means salal berries. So wonder what we were doing there. There's a place here called let's see, let's looking at the names, trying to see another one. Snustsa. Snustsa means the first um, a point of land. So when you leave the bay, it's the first um, point of land. I think it's now called Sans Point. But we named the land off what we use the land for, or what the land looked like, or how it linked to our legends. And we definitely owned land in that way. Our economy, in this new world, we hoard resources. It's almost this strange reality that we feel that the more money we have, the happier we'll be. The larger our house, the more vehicles we have, the more land we own, seems to be this ability to show status as how much we can accumulate. In the pre-contact world, it was quite literally the opposite. So as you see on the outside of these homes, there's these walkways. These walkways are called Heitshen, and all along our homes were always Heitshen. Outside your home would be a Heitshen. And Heitshen had one use for standing atop and throwing gifts into the audience. As you can see, they threw a woolly dog a blanket into an audience. You can see all the hands up reaching for it. Why are they doing this? What is happening? In this new world, when we want to record something, we write it down. We get it uh, notarized. When you have a wedding or a will or a new child or something, you need to get it written and properly notarized so that everybody can read your fancy little piece of a paper that says it's yours or that this is who you are and that that's how it is. We didn't write things down. Not that we didn't understand writing. We absolutely had ways of transcribing stories through art. So it's not that we didn't understand how to transform stories or words into shapes, but that we looked at this um, uh, differently. We had something called witnessing. You may often hear about it if you're involved in anything to do with our ceremonies, but it happens like this. Let's say you wanted to hand over some land or a name or have a wedding. You would host what we would call a Spinnakers. A Spinnakers is a large gathering, and at that gathering, you would invite everybody from your village and many people from the surrounding villages. One of the most recent happened here in Quw'utsun. There were thousands of people there. They say upwards of 11,000 people were there. So, like I said, if your house has 100 people in it, now you have to be ready to receive thousands of people. And when your visitors arrive, you need to do a few things. You need to ensure that they are adequately fed the whole time you're hosting. And hosting usually lasted anywhere between 4 days to a week. So you needed to host them by ensuring they could eat, by ensuring they had a shelter. And after the event, you would lavish them with uh, gifts. So let's say you handed over a name to a young man or a young woman. Everybody that you've invited would stand there and witness the process of you handing over that name, so that the act of that happening would live in their memories, not on a notarized, like sheet of like paper. It would live in the minds of the community, and lavishing them with gifts helps to um, solidify it. Every time you hold that woolly dog blanket, you'll remember where you received it and what happened. And so it's kind of like a oath to remember. But to make this happen, 100 people would need to spend years accumulating resources to literally give them away. At the end of these Sitlanach, that host house would have next to nothing. They might have enough to eat for a little while, but they would have handed away most of their like resources. So the objective here was to acquire enough resources to give them away. And the potlatch ban came into effect because the original colonists were worried we were going to run out of resources because we kept handing everything away. And nothing is stranger to European society than watching somebody literally hand the like shirt off their back over and over and over and over again. But what we need to understand is that if there were 20 houses in a village and each of these lasted 4 days, you're literally heading to one of these every week, every other week. There's another house hosting. So these resources weren't just accumulated, they were handed around, they were passed through the villages, house to house to house. Everyone was wealthy because everyone was wealthy. Everyone had everything they needed because everybody shared everything they had. So we were all wealthy because we shared, not because we hoarded things. And this I've labeled as the economy of generosity. Once again, imagine how much food we waste in this new world, how much we spend and invest in growing, uh, 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 um, bananas, like slash and like burn the Amazon to grow bananas, to have them come to a grocery store to wind up getting thrown out because somebody doesn't want to hand them away for free because they don't want to remove the value of bananas. Imagine if everything was just handed around, if we could all return to an economy of generosity. Now, the last one of these aspects before I move on is I want to I really want you to understand when we say that we're all related to the land, what we mean. Elders often will highlight to you, oh, son, we're all related. The mountains, the trees, the river, the animals, the rocks, we're all family. And in this new world, we'll hear that and we'll think, oh, okay, kind of hokey, right? But maybe there's more to it than that. And so this is kind of where that comes from. To understand this story I'm about to share, you need to know two things. You need to know, as I was referencing earlier, about our names. Our names are genealogical, okay? They're handed through the generations from one to the next to the next to the next, so that my name, I can trace back 11 generations. But if I really knew my history and I spent more time with those elders, I could have, probably traced it back more generations than that to the original, story and source of, the name I wear. Every one of our names is like this. They're handed through the generations. And some of these names are very, very old. That's our names. The other thing you need to know is about our legends. So we know so much about European legends. We know about Hercules and we know about Hera, and we know about Thor and Cleopatra and all these Western heroes and legends and stories, but we don't know enough about our own local Vancouver Island or Western Canada or even stories from Turtle Island. As you know, we started, today hearing about the story of the three sisters, right? We should be learning more of those. Though I will highlight, we did not have the three sisters here, but learning those style of stories. So to know this story, you need to know one individual who's in many of our stories on Vancouver Island, and his name was Peltz. Peltz is when I'm explaining him to my children, I like to explain to him kind of like Maui from the movie Moana. He's a bit of a trickster, he's a bit of a wild card, but unlike Maui's ability to transform himself, Geld has the ability to transform anything into anything else. He can transform a rock into a tree, he can transform, like a human into, or like a salmon or a human into a rock. And when we're small children, the elders like to share stories about how health transforms children who don't listen into rocks. So you spend a lot of time kind of looking around for health to make sure he's not running around gonna try to like change you into a rock. I think the elders just wanted us to listen, but you know what I mean. So health can change things. Now, this story is about a man named Qwustenuxun, and they say Qwustenuxun lived thousands of years ago, thousands of years ago. And Qwustenuxun, he lived in one of our houses, had a big family like all of us, and he had a special power. He would walk off into the woods. He would head up for a walk, and on his walk, he would have, like ideas in his head, like a vision. He'd be out in the woods and he'd think to himself, I need to weave a hat. Okay. And he'd rush home and he'd weave a really nice hat. He'd spend hours, even days on it, make it look really nice. And once his hat was ready, someone would arrive at his house and he could hear them as they ran into the house and they'd say, I need a hat. Oh, I need a hat. And Bateson would walk over with his hat and go, oh, look, this hat's ready here. You can have this hat. And he'd hand it over to them. And they go, oh, Bateson, what do I have to have? What do I have to hand you for this hat? And he'd say, no, no, you can just have the hat. You can have it just like that. There you go. And they'd say, oh, hi, chka, thank you, hi, chka, Bateson. And they'd leave. And he'd go have another walk in the forest and he'd think, I need to make a bentwood box. And he'd walk home and he'd work and he'd make a bentwood box, get it all looking really nice, make it all carved up, look really good. And just as it was done, someone would walk into his house and say, "Oh, I need a Benwood box. Oh, the answer to thump. Where is a Benwood box?" And Bateson would walk over and go, "Oh, look, I have one. You can have this one." And they'd say, "Oh, Bateson, what do I have to give you for this?" And they'd say, "Well," and he'd say, "You don't have to give me anything. Here, you can have this." And in the story, I think there's about 20 objects, but to really try to wrap it up, because I'll be here all day, he'd walk into the forest, he'd have an idea, he'd have a vision, he'd go home, he'd transform that vision into reality. And once it was ready, someone would arrive and ask for it, and he'd give it to them, and he'd never ask them for anything. One day, Bateston was an elder, and he was in one of our longhouses, and there were many other people, and there's a big, Slanuk happening, hundreds of other people there. And in the middle of the Slanuk, Bateston was in the middle of the floor, and in walked Gelt into the longhouse. And many people in Longhouse were afraid of Gelt. They ran away screaming, but not Bateston. He stood right in the middle of Longhouse, didn't even move. And Gelt walked right up to him, and he looked at him, and he said to Bateston, he said, "Bateston, I've been watching you. Anytime anybody needs anything, you hand it over to them, and you don't ask them for nothing." And Bateston says, "Yes, yes, this is our way, Gelt." And Gelt, he says to him, "How would you like to help all your relations forever?" And Bateson just raises his hands and says, "Oh, Haichka, thank you." And Chelts transforms him into the very first red cedar tree. And if you know anything about our culture here, we use the red cedar tree for everything. We use it for our house posts. We use it for our canoes. We use it for our clothing. We use it for our baskets. We use it for everything. And so it helps us. And now the name Gbetston has lived through the generations. And now the youngest child that I have wears the name Gbetston. So that lets us know that genealogically, in our way, our name can actually trace all the way back to Gbetston. So we're related to the man who was transformed into the first red cedar tree. And so in that way, we are related to the red cedar tree. It is a relative. Every tree, every rock, every animal, everything has a story like that, where we relate to it. It is our relative. And if you look at this visualization on here, you can see these people are splitting a tree plank right from the tree. But what I want to highlight there is they would only remove one of those planks, and they could leave the tree alive. They didn't have to fall the tree to harvest it. They could just harvest one of those and leave the tree alone. It would heal, and then 25 years later they could harvest another one. They left the tree alive because they knew it was their relative. So imagine living in a world where your entire community understood that everything you see is your relative, and it needs to be uh, treated with that reverence and respect of an old auntie or an old uncle that you love and that you want to look after. So that leads us into food systems. And so I'm always advocating for a return to indigenous food systems. Let's talk about the weir. This is what we call a shait. Yeah, okay. I'll highlight kind of how this works, where we are, and kind of what I want to happen in the future. This is our shait. When the original colonists arrived, they were overwhelmed by how many salmon there were. There were so many fish. Hundreds of thousands, if not a million, would travel up our river every year. There were so many fish. The original colonists would highlight that you could eat, fish every day and you'd never run out of fish. I want people to know that that wasn't an accident, That's not rewilding. That's not the way that like nature works. That was direct human intervention to create thriving salmon stocks through the invention of aquaculture that we call scheid, that the Western world now refers to as a weir. You look at this weir right here, and you might think, okay, it's a fence in a river. You might even, if you're very westernized, you might even assume you could run the entire weir across the river and stop all the fish and harvest them all if you wanted to. Nobody ever did that, but you could. You absolutely could. So you can see they left a hole in the weir. There's a large area there where the uh, fish could easily travel around the weir. If you had a million, salmon traveling up the river, you could have runs or schools that were traveling up the river at once that could be, you know, 10,000. So you might not want to try to stop them all. You might wreck your weir if you tried to do so. So then, well, why have a weir at all? If you look, there are two weir lines running parallel to the river that run perpendicular to the long line that runs across the river. Those two lines, right in between them, is a small hole that allows one salmon to travel through at a time. So if you've got 10,000 salmon traveling up the river at once, you could literally just reach into the water and throw them up onto the edge. And you wouldn't need a spear, you wouldn't need a net, you wouldn't need anything. You could just throw them. But you can't choose them then. You can't be selective. That hole in between those two walkways allows you to be selective. You can watch the like salmon travel through the hole one at a time. You can see their health, you can see their species, you can see their sex, and you can harvest them on those three factors. And our traditional way, from what I've learned, is that we harvest the weaker male fish. We occasionally harvest strong males. We'll occasionally harvest the females, but the vast majority of the time, we are heavily encouraged to only harvest weaker male fish. Now, if you know anything about salmon reproduction, weaker male fish that they don't get a chance to reproduce will deliberately destroy the nests of healthier reproductive salmon. They will even eat the eggs of other salmon because they're frustrated or whatever it is. They are um, detrimental to the salmon reproduction. So if we remove them frequently, we increase reproduction. And if we remove them frequently, we also remove those weaker genetics. The oldest scheid that we've located, they're probably older, but the oldest one is in Washington State, and it's over 6,000 years old. How many salmon generations can you run through in 6,000 years? About 1,000, a little over 1,000. So imagine for 1,000 generations, you increase reproductivity and removed weaker genetics for 1,000 generations. What happens to a population? It gets stronger, it gets healthier, and it becomes more numerous, which is what the original colonists witnessed when they arrived. This tremendous volume of salmon. We didn't harvest them all. We harvested what we needed. We harvested enough for us to eat, enough for us to host, and enough for us to trade. And always remembered that we were not the only weir on the river. There were many weirs on the river, going all the way up, especially if you go across the river over to the Fraser River, runs for hundreds of kilometers. So there could be hundreds of other weirs at the river. Everyone understood and acknowledged that we didn't need to harvest all the fish. We just needed what we needed and needed to leave enough for everyone else, including, the animals and the trees. Because the the vegetation that lives along the river also needs the nutrients that are in those salmon runs. So we always needed to leave enough. So this technology produced no carbon dioxide, produced no impact on the climate. It actually probably was a net uh, carbon sink because you would be producing a higher volume of a species that would be eating up uh, carbon that had wound up in the river cycle or within the ocean, and then we'd eat it. But now let's look at modern day fishing. Okay, just as an example, our river here once had thousands, like I said, hundreds of thousands, if not like a million fish. Now we're lucky if we get 30 thousand in a year. That's like 3% or something. It's very small. And so this new salmon harvesting technique of, with the big uh, seine nets and bottom trawlers and all that stuff has just absolutely uh, decimated our salmon. And most of that, well, not most, but a lot of that salmon is not even used. They throw the heads off of them in the ocean so that when they arrive, they don't weigh so much. But our elders love the heads. We eat heads. They, if they harvest the wrong ones by accident, they got a license to harvest, chum, but they pull up a whole bunch of, like sockeye. Well, they just re-release them, and most of them, like, will die. There was an area outside of uh, Bernie Inlet they used to call Strawberry Fields because the licenses were always for sockeye salmon, but they kept taking up red snapper. But red snapper does not survive being released from a net. They'd all die. Now there's not much red snapper out in that way anymore. And so imagine if we could invest in this, right? Imagine. So as you heard, I'm the chair for the Indigenous Advisory Council to the Ministry of Agriculture and Food, and I'm trying to remind them of changes that could happen that could help the generations of the climate. I like to use this example, and I raise chickens, so I know it very well. If you've ever raised any chicken, they need a lot of resources. They need to be warmed, they need to be housed, they need special, like food. And if you look into it, where are chickens from? Chickens originated in Africa and then moved into Europe where they were hybridized into all these varieties we have now. And then they're moved over here. They're not from here. They're not genetically or physically designed to exist in the ecosystem that we all exist in here now on the West Coast. So they need a tremendous amount of resources to ensure that they survive and they can be adequately processed. But as an example, imagine if we could stop producing chicken and reinvest all of those resources and funds into restoring salmon populations. Imagine if we could do less open like net like fishing in the ocean and start reinstating weir systems where we can selectively harvest to help restore the thriving uh, uh, populations of salmon. When we do that, we stop producing greenhouse gases when we produce the chicken feed or the transport for the chicken feed or the electricity needed to house or warm the chickens and all the transportation of the meat and the chicken processing and all that work. If we transferred that to salmon production and we invested in that, what are we investing in? We're investing in the health of the watershed. They need healthy water. So now we're investing in healthy watersheds and environmental restoration and indigenous technologies, which are low well, they're either carbon neutral or a carbon sink, and we start restoring the environment while increasing our food production, moving away from Western foods like chicken and towards indigenous foods like salmon could be a massive step in the restoration of our environment. That's just one though. Like let's look at our Qwustenuxun, so clam gardens, also known as uh, seafood gardens. So if you travel up and down the island at all, the west coast, you'll notice that most of our island is rocky outcroppings. There's not a whole lot of sandy shorelines. And so in order to grow shellfish, you need, well, you don't need, but it's easier to harvest from sandy shorelines. And so the ancestors knew or learned technology to create a sandy shoreline. You look for two rocky outcroppings of land, like one in the top end of your screen and one in the lower end of your screen. And then in uh, between them, you create a rock wall at the lowest of the low tide lines that is about as high as the high tide line. And you leave the space behind it open. And you move all the rocks into that rock wall. And some of those rocks can be as large as like small vehicles. These were massive structures that lasted for thousands of years. Some of the oldest clam garden walls can be over 3,000 years old. I believe that they're probably older than that because we don't always realize it. But 3,000 years ago, the ocean actually rose. And so a lot of our clam gardens would have wound up under the ocean. And if we were to do underwater archaeology, I'm pretty sure we'd start running into older versions of these. So we've been using them for thousands of years. But if once you have that rock wall, what happens is that the ocean washes over that wall and slowly deposits the like sand and silt on the other side of the wall, raising up the land to be the same height as that rock wall with sand and silt. But also, that sand and silt has had no species in it to deplete its nutrient resource. It's just fresh. And so our ancestors would then transplant their prized clams or shellfish into those habitats. If you look into the anthropology and the archaeology of it, you can actually witness the increase in size of our prized sahwa, our a butter clam, which a little over 3 or 4 thousand years ago would be about the size of like a loonie, and nowadays is about the size of your fist. So by choosing the largest, healthiest specimens to transplant into these gardens, we genetically advanced the species to become larger and healthier and thrive. These spaces were so overproductive that if you did not frequently harvest from them, they would literally choke themselves out, run out of nutrients. They would often uh, uh, become diseased, and then they would probably die. So they needed to be harvested from frequently, or they would overpopulate. And so in the late 1800s, when early colonization hit the west coast of Canada, so did smallpox. Our our nation was between 15 and 20,000 individuals, and within 25 or 30 years, we were all the way down to 300 people. Smallpox really hurt us. So what happened is that these areas, that's what happened. They overpopulated, they weren't used, and the colonists had no idea they exist. They were rediscovered in the late 90s. We knew they were there, but now science is relearning what we already knew. But once again, imagine if we could invest in the creation of this space to grow shellfish instead of what we do now. If you've ever eaten a clam or an oyster in a restaurant, you're eating an invasive clam or an invasive oyster. The traditional clams here, the little necks, the butter clams, and the gooey ducks, if they are harvested at all, are all instantly shipped overseas, but normally in small quantities. And the oyster that traditionally lived here did not produce enough to be able to reach the commercial levels that we require now. So we brought over Japanese oysters. And if you walk around the edge of the ocean and you see oysters everywhere, there's a 99% chance those are invasive oysters. Most of our youth have no idea that they're eating invasive species. A lot of us just assume that these are what have lived here for thousands of years, but it's not. So maybe working to restore spots or spaces like this and regrow traditional seafoods could be a way to start moving away from other Western proteins like chicken. We could grow enough clams to have it be one of our strongest trade goods. We would trade dried clams as high up as Kamloops up and up into the Yakima River. We would trade up into Kamloops for jade and up down the Yakima River for obsidian, but anthropological evidence has been located of our dried clams in areas as far east as Calgary and as far north as Alaska and the Yukon and as far south as northern California. And so those are the clams that we raised in these clam gardens. We were able to raise enough that we could eat it, we could use it for our feast, but we also use it practically for our currency. Now, lastly, in the agricultural sphere here, um, Span. Span is also known as um, Macamus. And this beautiful flower grows a root that can be eaten. And the root of span is high in something called inulin, which helps to regulate our blood sugar. And span was cultivated like agricultural like systems. Span grows normally in unison with what we call pwasp, also known as a Gary oak tree. The Gary oak tree, when you start looking into the lineage of it, comes mostly from Washington State and may have even been intentionally uh, planted into the island and up into the interior and along the west coast. These trees and flowers create what the elders have referred to as a recessive ecosystem, meaning that if you don't harvest these flowers and seasonally uh, um, uh, burn the grass, that other local species will slowly invade and invade until they choke out these Gary Oak meadows. The Gary Oak meadows will slowly uh, uh, disappear without direct human intervention. So our ancestors would be weeding away the snowberry and the young fir trees from the edge of these meadows and intentionally expanding them so they could grow more span. Now, span, when grown wild, without being looked after at all for a long time as it has now, will often grow to be the size of your thumb. When it is properly cultivated, can actually grow to be the size of your like fist. And this is through not only genetic selection, which we were absolutely doing, but also loosening the earth around the root, so the root has room to expand. Now, these roots were also a very strong trade good that would be frequently traded. But what I want to highlight here is that this is agriculture. We directly planted these ecosystems, expanded them, utilized them, cultivated them for thousands of years. This is indigenous agriculture, and we would do that with span. We do it with what we call Skeoth, which is called Wapato now, or Setlelek, which is also called rice root. These roots were looked after through indigenous agricultural practices for thousands of years. And something I hear in my high level work through the Ministry of Agriculture is that, and it's a direct result of the changing climate, is that we're running out of water access, right? We're not getting the rains we got. Water is not as um, accessible. In the winter, it rains and floods, and the water runs away, and we don't hold on to enough of it. But you know what? When we're growing Western food crops like broccoli and almonds and I don't know, all those other European foods or non North American foods, they need a lot of water. They are very water intensive. What is not water intensive? Span, Skeos, Setleleko. All these traditional roots are not water intensive. If you've, I heard people earlier referencing that, they watch my videos. You know what's not water intensive? Salmon berries, and you can eat their shoots. You know what's not water intensive? Thimbleberries or maple trees. Those large trees regulate water. If you learn about our large trees, they absorb water when it rains, and their trunks will get swollen with water. And as the land becomes dry, they actually release water and help the local uh, plants thrive. And one of the big struggles we're having here in our homeland is that it's all been logged. And so those big trees, those really big cedars and firs and um, maples that used to hold all that water are not in there to hold that water anymore. But if we started letting those things return and we could utilize their food, their vegetables, like if you've seen a maple tree, a massive one, in flower, you can see what I mean by the quantity of like food you could be acquiring. And if you've if you've eaten them, they taste like broccoli. So why are we still growing broccoli? Why aren't we growing and learning how to store maple flowers? Why are we not working a little bit to do maybe a little bit of genetic, selection to grow, like a maple tree that can produce longer lasting flowers so that they don't only last like an hour in the refrigerator, but and then they wilt. That's what happens now, but they that will last. Like why, or even why aren't we not just eating with like the seasons? I guess one more aspect to highlight here before I move on. The elders will highlight to me all the time that eating the way we eat now is madness. Eating avocados in January, eating tomatoes in January, strawberries in January is madness. They will highlight that the earth provides what we need when we need it, and we need to start remembering that because we're not healthy the way we're eating now. We'll act like we're healthy, but we're not. What do I mean? Springtime right now, young shoots. Spring is a time of rejuvenation. It's a time of leaving the longhouse, returning to the land. The light is returning. We're starting to adventure. We need to reawaken our insides to be eating vegetables and other things. And so the land provides vegetables, young shoots from the salmonberry, the thimbleberry, the maple tree, the maple flowers, the rose flowers, the Oregon grape shoots, the like the list goes on and on. There's young shoots you can eat right now. and they're strongly uh, um, bitter, and they awaken your appetite. And if you don't eat a lot of sugar, they actually have a sweetness to them. But now we're so, um, uh, flavor blind because we eat so much sugar that we don't even understand how sweet, these things are. So springtime, young vegetables, reawakening. Uh, Summertime, long days, long traveling, long harvesting. What are we eating? High sugar foods, the thimbleberries, the salmon berries, the blackberries, the salal berries, right? High sugar to keep us active, keeping us alert, keeping us on the move for these long days. You move into, like the fall, we're eating roots. Elders would say that in the springtime, the flower throws up leaves again, and then like it'll flower, and during the summertime it'll like it'll make seeds, but in the like fall, all that energy returns to the root. And when I hear energy, I also hear calories return into the root. So we go harvest all those roots through the fall. We eat roots, we eat the mushrooms, we eat these slowing down foods that are helping us to slow down to get ready for the winter. Wintertime, we're eating, salmon and um, shellfish and, dried um, berries, and we're like resting, and we're storytelling, and we're with our, like families on the inside of our longhouses. And then it returns to spring, and it's like rejuvenation again, and all these young shoots. And it's this loop. The earth provides what you need when you need it, and we're not eating with it anymore. We're just eating whatever we want because that's what we want. But maybe if we looked at what's happening outside and realized that we are the environment, we can start looking at what's happening inside as a reflection of what's happening outside. We'd be healthier. My 8-year-old wrote this. People think it's absolutely amazing, but he wanted everybody to know what we could eat. It was 2020. There wasn't a lot going on in the grocery stores, and he wanted everybody to eat. Hey, Dad, how do we help them eat? He helped me write this, and I just using it like an example of if in 8 years he could learn all this. Imagine what we could learn if we spent a few years actually trying. Right? He just knew when it was ready. He knew what they were used for. He knew what they were called. And this is that eating with, the year, right? I want to quickly walk through this, and I want to leave some room for questions, but there's just so much that we could highlight, that if we could start reconnecting with how traditional societies ate and lived from the land, how much of our carbon and our climate change issues are related to our, food systems. What did they say in that little song? More cows, more uh, farts, right? Like, why are we eating so many cows? What's wrong with, like a deer, or, like elk meat, or, octopus, or, like salmon? Like, if we only eat one food instead of eating lots of foods, we wind up with a problem. So let's widen out what we're eating. And just to wrap it all together, we've talked about language, we've talked about the culture, we've talked about food. This triangle will explain it in a way that I really hope lands with everybody. So this triangle is an example of a food system. And to explain this triangle and a food system to you, I'm going to use my favorite food, smoked fish. I've been smoking fish since I can like remember. Some of my earliest like memories are smoking fish. So the very height of the triangle is eating. It's the result of an entire food system, right? Is to eat something. When we eat our smoked fish, we eat it with um, fats. When I was a kid, we ate it with lard because that's all we had. But in the old world, we eat it with something called uh, um, Itna, now known as ulican oil. And if you look into it, Qwustenuxun oil is like the olive oil of the West Coast. It's got all these amazing nutrients. It's very healthy. It's very local. It's very strong. And if we could start using Qwustenuxun oil, I bet we'd all be a lot healthier. But in order to eat it, it's normally cooked, heated in water, not always, but heated in water to rehydrate it. Now, I like asking youth, if you didn't have a stove or a steel a pot or anything like that, how would you heat water? And you get some amazing answers. The real answer is that we'd heat up specific rocks, which are volcanic uh, basalt rocks. And once they're red hot, we lower them into a waterproof, heat resistant container that has been filled with water, or a bentwood box with a bunch of water in it. You lower that rock into the water, and the heat from the rock transfers into the water. And you remove the rock when it's no longer warmer than the water, and you add a new rock that is hot, and you remove and replace rocks in the water until the water is as hot as you would like. This technique actually works pretty quickly. You'd be rather surprised. So that's how we heat water. We heat rocks. We use our thump. That's our uh, box. You have to know right, like how to harvest. The right rock. You have to know how to use it. You got to learn this. So you have to learn this in the old world in order to be able to heat water. But in order to eat smoked fish, it has to be heated in water. In order to heat it in water, you've got to have smoked fish. You've got to know how to properly smoke it. And so you got to know how to hang dry it. You got to know how to slice it so it's wide open like that. You got to know how long it needs to be in your smokehouse. You need to know how to create your fire. I like asking youth again, how many kinds of, like fire do you know? They say one. And I say there's about 100 varieties of, like fire. This one that you have in your smokehouse is low and cold, no flame, only smoke. So if you heard me, there's no flames, it's not hot, and it just smokes. And you have to know how to make that work. And it's only either with wood of alder trees or maple trees. You're not using anything else in the fire. So you need to learn how to do that. And when you're smoking your like fish, it's hanging in there for anywhere between 3 days, to a week. And if you're doing, like one batch after batch after batch, it can be weeks. But in order to keep that fire just right, because if it gets too hot, all those like fish in the rafters will get too hot and will actually rip off of their wood and land on the floor. If it gets too cold, all of that like fish will actually get wet and instantly go rancid. So you need to hold that space between 12 degrees and 30 degrees Celsius at all times. So you're checking on that uh, fire every hour and a half for as long as it has to be, and that's 24 hours a day. As an example, there's a cross stick. If you look, you can see holding the salmon open. Those are called our ta'ats. So you need to learn how to make ta'ats. All the wood that it's hanging on, the wood we use for the ta'ats, the wood in the fire, the wood she's got for that handle she's using is all specific wood. The wood you use for everything that makes contact with your like fish has to be antimicrobial, antibacterial, anti um, fungal. So you have to know all that wood. And as an example, those cross sticks are called tats, and that's the root word of another word, which is tats usp, which is the Halkomedenum word for the English word for the plant spirea. Spirea is known as tats usp, and the word ta'atsasp translates to the wood you use for ta'ats. So what were we using for our ta'ats? Spirea. There are 3 or 4 other plants you can use for your ta'ats, but just using an example of how our language is a recipe, right? That's what I was referencing way at like the beginning. Our language is a recipe for life. Many of our words weave into what we need in order to be able to live. And so just in order to smoke our, like fish, you have to know so much information. In order to smoke fish, you've got to have a fish. And in order to have a fish, you have to know when they're going to be in the river. What species are you harvesting? What Where on the river can you harvest it? And what do they look like underwater, 20 feet away, 100 feet away while they're traveling? You have to be able to identify species and sex. Like I said, you're trying to get only the weaker males. Which ones look weak? Which ones look strong underwater, 100 feet away? So you need to be active. You need to live this life. If you look on your right-hand side, you can see 3 generations there, right? I've been using these like spears ever since I was the age of, my young sons here, right? And only now that I'm an old man over here, only now can I throw and hit where I want to hit, and can I choose which species and like sex I want underwater from, you know, 20 yards away. So we need to know all that in order to harvest it, and you have to work at it. You have to be experienced. Those spears, the ones that the adults are using up the river there, they are 10 to 12 like feet long and can weigh 25 to 30 pounds. These are hard things to use. It's not easy. It's work. Just really quickly, there's a word on here says spear rods, and the word above it is Caithoch. Caithoch is the root for the name Caith Asp. Uh, Caith Asp is the Hulkameetnam name for ocean spray, or the shrub known as ocean spray. Ocean spray is known as uh, Caith Asp, which translates to the wood you use to make Caith Oak. So traditionally, those rods on the end of the spear, which we now use steel rods for, used to be made out of ocean spray limbs. Just another example of how the language lets you know how to live linked onto the land. All these words, Tlako Shaitan, Thicalts, Tha'astan, all have roots in how they work, what you harvested, or how they are designed, so that the anatomy of the spear even helps you learn how to use it and how to uh, um, create it. But in order to have a spear, in order to harvest, you need to know how to design your traditional harvesting equipment. You can't acquire it at, like Walmart. They don't have it. I've looked. So this is another one of those traditional harvesting implements we'd use to harvest our salmon. It's called achthimtan. Achthimtan is our dip nets. A lot of our like villages had their own versions of these nets. I used a version kind of like the one in the center of the photo. But what I want to highlight here is that the hoops are made of specific wood that needs to be harvested at a specific time of the year so it warps and doesn't snap, right? You don't just wander through the woods and harvest whatever you want. You need to be able to harvest the right wood at the right time to be able to warp those hoops. And then you have to know like how to like lash the hoop to the handle, how to weave your net. What is the fibers for your net? So much information you need to learn just to be able to design these harvesting tools. And where do we learn all this stuff, right? We learn all of these traditional techniques on smoking and harvesting and tool making and cooking and all that stuff when we're small. We watch elders, we watch uncles, we watch aunties, we watch our relatives, and we learn through watching. I've never witnessed anybody work on a weir in my life. I've read about it a lot. So instead of letting my son live that exact experience I had, he's witnessed it because we worked on a weir. And you know what? It was amazing because I didn't need anything extra. You look at what's in my hand, it's a rock from the edge of the river. The wood I'm using in that weir was on the edge of the river and it went into the riverbed so smoothly. It was as if the river was waiting to have that in there again. And within, like a week, we had a weir. He knew how to do it. And when he's an elder, one day, many years from today, I'm not here anymore, he can say, I worked on a weir once when I was small with my dad, because that'll help to rejuvenate it, right? That'll help us learn. I remember having to repair nets, right? You remember, like this net? Well, my uncle, would walk in the door with a big hole in his net, and he'd ask me to repair it. I was young. I had to learn, but then every time there was a hole, I'd have to repair it. When the hoop got wrecked, we'd have to learn how to repair it. Then if it ever got wrecked again, it was up to me to repair it. If the handle got wrecked, he'd help me learn how to repair it, and then I'd have to repair it. But when I was the right age to have my own net, I knew how to weave it, I knew how to make a hoop, and I knew how to make a handle because when I was young, I witnessed it. I worked on it. Now, what am I highlighting? If we don't eat smoked like fish, none of that stuff happens. Nobody's harvesting it. Nobody's having to smoke it. Nobody's remembering how to heat those hot rocks. Nobody's remembering the ulacan oil or eating it with fats. They're not remembering how to harvest the wood or the traditional names for the tats or the achthimtan or anything. When we don't eat the result of a food system, the food system dies. And within our food systems, all of them, the whole world, every food system is our culture, our language, the way we link to the land, the way we link to each other, the way we link. And every single day we eat. At least I really hope you eat every day. And some of us, like me, we eat 3, maybe 4 times a day. Every time we eat, we choose, we make a choice. Whether it's deliberate or not, or intentional or not, we choose what we eat. And when we choose what we eat, we choose what we support. When you eat at, like McDonald's, you're supporting a Western food system that is using water and resources like they're unlimited. When you're eating from these non-sustainable food systems, you're casting a vote for non-sustainability. And I know it's hard. We have lots to do. We're all working. Food's expensive, right? I'm speaking from an extreme place of a privilege, but somebody needs to start. We need to start, even if it's just once a day, once a week, you think, okay, I'm going to eat local food today. I'm going to eat sustainable food today. I'm going to, raise one chicken a year because I don't want to have to, like support that other system or I'm going to help restore the watershed this weekend by, you know, working with, like a local organization, right? Like, what can we do to enhance our like food systems so the way we eat can literally la, la, like save the world? Because honestly, of all the ways we could rescue the world from the changing climate, I think food is the strongest one. It links transport, it links environmentalism, it links carbon output and uh, uh, like methane. It links it all into one. And I've got a whole bunch of other slides, but we're running out of time, and I want to leave some room for questions and hopefully a conversation because I always like to reference that we're this is very overwhelming. Of course it is, right? We don't know anything about, in indigenous foods or how to rescue the world or anything. And why me? And I look at it and I want to let you know that just like I'm the first generation to not have to attend residential school, we are the first generation to have conversations like this. We are the first generation where we can hear from our indigenous relatives about their language, how they ate, and how they link to the land. We're the first to look at the opportunities, the myriad of opportunities for change. Because up until now, these conversations in some capacity were either unwelcome or outright illegal. The information I've highlighted here, 50 years ago, I could be arrested for. I've used my language, I've highlighted, the traditional ways, and a lot of that stuff was not okay. So when you hear this and you think about all this, it can be overwhelming. But don't let it overwhelm you. Understand that you are the first generation to have this opportunity. And I'd like to look at it, like a feast. Who goes to the feast first? The elders do. Who usually eats, the least? Always not all, but a lot of elders eat very little. And you walk up to that really big feast and you see all this beautiful food and you think you want to eat it all, but you know what? You've just got one small like plate. So choose what you can do on your small little, like plate. And remember that as a result of you being the very first one, you can choose anything. You don't have to choose what's left. You're the first. You can choose those easy jobs, the little ways to help it all change. Instead of letting it overwhelm you, focus on what works. I've been speaking at you for an hour and a half, and I'm sure you're all exhausted of listening to me now. So I'd love to hear from you. I'm going to hop over in the chat and I'm going to look and see if anybody actually wrote any questions because, like I said, I'm not even going to look at the chat, but I'm going to look now and I'll see, and then we'll see. Intros, great. I'm glad somebody. Can we produce enough food to? Well, yes, but no, but yes. Okay, so the question was, could we produce enough food with this method for the size of the world population today? Yes, 100%, but not through indigenous West Coast, food. We can't like feed everybody salmon. It's just not realistic. I went to the UN World Food Forum in Rome in 2023 and spent 3 days listening to food leaders from indigenous communities from across the world. The example that I really like to highlight is the colonization of Ethiopia. When we think of Ethiopia, we think of hot and dry, but that is not true. A lot of it is uh, jungle and wetlands and wonderful. And this woman, these African women, oh my God, they're such good warriors. They were highlighting how during colonization they were asked to grow rice. So I guess where they were from, they grow something called sorghum. And they would grow sorghum and they would eat it. And it was amazing. And for generations, that's what, they'd eat. And they would grow one to um, uh, the two crops a year and they'd have lots to eat and to, like share and to like trade. And then when they were colonized, they were required to provide the government with a ration of rice. So then they had to change their sorghum over to rice fields. And then slowly that ration grew until they were doing one rice harvest a year. Now they're doing two, and now they're doing four. And the ground is no longer yielding what it would yield because there's no nutrients left. They've had to use it up to grow a food product that doesn't normally live there. And she was adamant that rice is not from where they live, that they ate this other food, and that she was literally trying to petition the UN to allow them to stop growing rice so they could grow sorghum again because they could use it to revitalize the land and revitalize what they're eating, and they wouldn't be hungry anymore. And so all around the world, every indigenous nation, and that's like at that conference, there were even the Sami people, which you might like assume are like white people. They're from like Norway. They were there referencing like the reindeer and how that's what they eat and that's how they live. And every nation, every land, everywhere has indigenous individuals who know how to eat from that land. And if we could start to collectively eat our indigenous like foods again instead of relying on global food capitalism, we could all eat that way. I think absolutely. There's this idea, and I hate this idea, that humans are, like a virus. There's lots of us. There's no way we could live. That is a direct lie. We are not the virus. The system is the virus. Like I said before, cutting down the Amazon rainforest to grow bananas to throw them away is insanity, right? Leave the Amazon rainforest alone and eat your own food. Like, stop, enough now. So yes, there is enough, but not if they all want to eat our food because there's not enough for everybody. Let's looking for some more questions. Oh, I see you. I'll be back, friend.
Yeah. Jared, thank you ever so much. I mean, me, myself, coming from a, South Asian country, India, where a lot of the people do eat seasonally. And so, this made so much of sense. And, the spiritual connection that you have to the land, and not just the food systems, but how we sustainably live and, have a social justice, element to that as well. I'd like to ask, because we are running a bit late, so we'll take a couple of questions. So if you'd like to raise your electronic hand, we can go. Okay, I think Eleanor, did you have a question? Yes? Okay, please unmute yourself.
Tara, I didn't want to interrupt you if you're asking a question. No? Okay. Can I be heard? All right. Jared, thank you. And I wanted to thank you for making a distinction between indigenous harvesting of animals and capitalist animal agriculture. It's something I've been writing about, and I feel that climate and justice organizations need to feel that they can oppose factory farming and industrial aquaculture without being disrespectful to indigenous food traditions. Quite the opposite. If we opposed factory farming, we could free up more land for indigenous food sovereignty. So thank you for making that distinction.
Michelle, would you like to ask your question? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Jared, for today. I'm really appreciative of the deeper learning you've offered. And we are fortunate to have space in Saanich, not too far from where you are, and have a lot of the plants on our land that you referenced. And I'm just seeking opportunities or resources or workshops or books that might help me continue to learn how to engage with these plants in a more meaningful way and to keep cultivating things and start eating from our land now. So we are already stewards, so a lot of it is here, but it would be wonderful to deepen that relationship. So I wondered if you had any recommendations.
Absolutely. I'm just trying to wonder if I have it just here or if it's just gonna have to verbally tell you. Les Cheem's uh plants. Luschim apostrophe S. Les Cheem's plants. He's an elder in our valley, worked with Nancy Turner, who is amazing, and they wrote an ethno botany book on a lot of our traditional plants and how they were used. There's
Okay.
also a free resource called the Hulkumetanum, HUL''Umi''Num, Hulkumetanum Ecosystem Guide. If you look it up online, it is freely available. It is not a huge resource, but it has a lot of information. And lastly, if you are in Saanich, I highly recommend you go to the Indigenous plant garden at uh, Fort Rod Hill and link
Okay.
with the lady. Oh, I'm gonna get her name wrong. It's Amanda or Allison. I wish I could remember her name. She's amazing, and
Okay.
she knows a lot. And they grow a tremendous amount of indigenous food plants, and so she is a wealth of knowledge on that. So.
Thank you very much. May I clarify the spelling of the first book that you recommended?
Sure.
Less.
Les James, yeah.
Mhm.
LUSCHIIM''S. Les James plants.
Less James plants. Okay, wonderful. I appreciate that. Thank you.
No problem. You're on mute, friend.
Yes, thank you. Are there any further questions? I think, Guy, did you have a question for Jared? Or should I let Lynn go first? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Lynn, you're on mute. Lynn, you're on mute.
I know. I was trying to unmute and it wouldn't let me. Yeah, I just wondered, would you say that it is possible for individuals in their own gardens, their own yards, to grow, regrow indigenous plants for food supply?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't know why not. I think that
Well, I mean, are the seeds available? Are the plants available for?
there's a place in Spanish called Satin Flower Nursery, and they grow, I think, specifically in indigenous plants, and they are very knowledgeable in our food plants, and they could help you with cultivation and garden planting and things like that. So we're working on a project in our estuary to restore an indigenous food system within the estuary, and we are working very closely with satin flower. So yeah, that's who I use.
Excellent.
No problem.
We've sourced a lot of our plants there as well. They're fantastic, and their website is an amazing resource.
Yeah, here we go. Great.
You're muted again, Tara.
I just had a quick question, Jared, and that was, was it the government that had given you the, where they were growing hay, cultivating hay, a hay field, and are you going to be growing indigenous, food plants, or is it medicinal plants, or a combination of both?
Yeah, okay. So I think you're talking about the Cowichan Estuary Restoration Project. The government did not give us that property. The government has not really been involved and actually has been a bit of a struggle. The property was obviously a traditional agricultural site pre-19 or 1890s. In the 1890s, it was preempted, which is a nice way of using the word stolen, and turned into a farm, and then it was diked off and owned by a wonderful family called the Dinsdale family, and that land was then sold in 1995 to Nature's Trust and Ducks Unlimited, who wanted to restore the land. And as wonderful hosts, they reached out to our nation and asked us kind of how we could help and how we could all work as one. And so now the idea is to return the land to small islands. So an estuary is usually a network of river channels, but unfortunately, because of colonization, our estuary only has two channels. So trying to remove the dikeway that runs around, it's 150 acres. Removing the dikeway to allow the river channels to re carve the land into small islands, which we used pre-contact to grow camas and chocolate lily root and wapato, as well as salmonberry and kachmin and like a host of other like indigenous food plants. But that is a generational project. It won't happen overnight. And so currently there is a 3-acre indigenous plant nursery on the land, which we call Halit and Spaskan, that'll be used to grow the seed crop to help rejuvenate those small islands once we can remove the dikeway. And just really, really quickly to highlight what I mean by the government's kind of in the way, we've all probably heard of the Agricultural Land Reserve. And that's okay. I love that we have, land specifically for having to grow food. That's excellent. But there is a list of approved crops in the Agricultural Land Reserve, and you can all probably imagine that that list of crops does not include indigenous like species. Most indigenous species in agriculture are looked at as, like weeds. So when we try to explain to them that we want to grow weeds, they don't like it. So lucky for me, in the space where I am as the Indigenous advisor to agriculture and food, I can now try to get those Indigenous agricultural crops recognized within the ALR. So it's a lot of work. Like I said, it'll be yeah, awesome. Yeah, it's a generational thing, but hopefully we can all restart together. Also, just wanted to highlight. I think I saw sh 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 Sharon raising her hand, but she can't actually raise her hand, so she's just, using her hand. So just wanted to add that. Yeah. Hi.
Cookstown. I was going to ask, I'm living in the Comox Valley, though I grew up in the Cowichan Valley and originally in Sconleth from the Secwepemc. So I remember my grandmother drying puck, which was Saskatoon berries mainly. Was there a lot of berry? Because when the berries used to be so abundant, and now you very seldom see them. The black caps, I don't run across them anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. So we used to grow the Saskatoons. With there's a space in the valley named after them, and the name for them is Tushnates. And so the area would be called Quw'utsun. And so there was a space where there were lots of them. That's where we go harvest them. And specifically in regards to the black caps, the problem with them is that the Himalayans have kind of eaten out their habitat. The Himalayan blackberry also loves where they lived, and so now that niche is kind of being overrun by the highly invasive Himalayan blackberry. So either we can start using Himalayan blackberries, or we're going to have to start doing a lot of work to remove the invasive species. But yeah, but salal berries. There's a list of wild cherries, wild plums, right? There's a lot of traditional berries that would be made into fruit leathers. I know that my ancestors used thimbleberries because they were high in uh, um, a pemmican, or no, not pemmican, uh, pectin, and they would be mashed in with other berries and spread onto skunk cabbage leaves because they are very waxy and left out in, like the sun to, to dry and then be easy to remove them. And it would, that was our traditional fruit leather. So yes, there was absolutely a lot of those, and they would be utilized. Yeah.
Yeah, I know the concern, like is the sockeye run Adams Lake, and it has so many barriers now that um, there's so much to overcome. It's the same with the loss in the Quw'utsun Valley of the very extensive camas fields in the Garryoke system. So I really appreciate you putting all of your work into this and your devotion, Jared.
Hi, Chika.
Guy, would you like to ask a question now?
Yes, Jared. I don't know if you know, I work full time on the whole climate crisis, and I'm very aware of the biggest impact is going to be sea level rise, and up to maybe 2 meters by the end of this century. And in fact, the last time the world was as warm as it's going to be by the end of this century, the sea level was 16 meters higher. So what I don't know is how shellfish work and whether they depend on access to the air between the tides for their existence, or whether they can be continually underwater. And what happens to our river estuaries and all the shellfish along the shores when the sea is 2 meters higher or a lot more if things get bad. So yeah, what do you do you and your elders discuss this future and the impacts of burning fossil fuels and eating meat in causing climate crisis?
So that's like two questions. Yes. Clams, I am not sure. I am not a specialist. I do know that sea level rose 3,000 years ago. I only know that through anthropology friends and my relatives who, when they're studying our traditional sites, are like, well, a lot of them are underwater now. And I was like, what do you mean they're underwater? And said, well, actually, like it rose, but it probably wasn't rising quite as uh, fast as it will. So if it has risen in the past, I would assume there's a level of adaptability, but it's how quickly. I know that there are species of clams that are always underwater. The uh, gooey duck lives 100% underwater, so I would not be surprised if the others could navigate a small while underwater, and then when they produce their like seeds into the water, I think the ocean would roll them up, right? As the waves happen to
Yeah.
upwards. Um, I was in the Elders Hall as their chef in 2018 when our elder Ron George went to a climate summit in Victoria, and he came home from that uh, summit and loudly announced to the elders that he had heard that within 100 years we would have no more red cedar on the island, and that within 100 years there's a very high chance our river would no longer reach like the ocean. So I had firsthand experience with that, with the elders and with the community looking at navigating that. And so the result of a lot of that work has been our tribal lands department working to try to navigate barriers, like specifically on the island. There's something called the ENN land grab. And so most logging happens on Crown land, except in Vancouver Island, where a vast majority of the land was actually handed over as uh, private land, which was then owned by logging companies. So they have less regulations. And so we're struggling with water because there's no trees, because the regulations around their logging are very loose. And so our nation is trying to use UNDRIP and um, drip at a highlight that if they keep removing the logs, we won't have access to our traditional food systems, which are technically protected. And so there are aspects where we are navigating, trying to slow the effects
Yeah.
of the climate here. But
Yeah.
we're
Okay.
we're not how to phrase it. our nations, the indigenous like population here is only 4%, so we can only do as much as we can do. Yeah.
So just as West Coast Climate Action Network, we're always looking for ways in which we can be good allies for you, support your needs, strengthen your voice, be there beside you. Thanks.
Right. Hi, Chika.
So I think we've come to the end. I mean, I think we could hold these conversations for, as you said, Jared, for many, maybe for another 2 hours. But, we have to wrap up now. But Haichika, OCM, for all the knowledge you've given us. And as Guy was saying, that, that we could be the best allies possible for you. And thank you to all Haichika, OCM, for all our attendees who have listened and accepted this knowledge with deep listening. Much gratitude to you all for being here. And just as we end, I just want to acknowledge that we as West Coast Climate Action Network, to be able to develop these events and bring them to you all, we do depend on donations. So I think my colleague Catherine, who's also the team lead for the Indigenous team, she'll just put some some links in the chat. So if you could, go to that page and also subscribe to our newsletter, because you'll get to know of so many events and climate stories and webinars and rallies and, of all the work being done, by people like Jared also in our newsletter. So I would really encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter as well. And our website will also be there. And and again, Haichika, OCM, Jared, our minds and hearts and souls are filled with, what you've shared with us today. And I think it's something that we're going to go back, think about, and make sure that policies are made. We don't have something, again, like a Bill 15, and we have good policies in place. So thank you, everyone, and have a very good afternoon. Thank you so much.